Does anyone even know when the first Bible was published? Well, I have spent about an hour and a half looking this up for you, and at the risk of being stitched by Dan McClellan, this is what I could find. Now, this question gets very complicated very fast because there's 45,000 different denominations of Christianity, so what you might believe, someone else might consider to be heresy. For that matter, the Catholic Bible, for instance, has 72 or 73 books in it, while the Protestant Bible has 66 books in it. However, if we want to look into the past and see how the biblical canon was first agreed upon, then we might be able to figure out when the first published Bible was. Starting with the Old Testament, it is largely taken from the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, which is 24 books divided into 3 separate parts. However, in the 3rd century BCE, Ptolemy II, the pharaoh of Alexandria, requested a new translation of the Tanakh in Greek because very few people spoke Hebrew at the time. And because of that, we have the Septuagint. The Septuagint, however, is comprised of 51 books because not only did they divide up several books in the Tanakh into their own individual books, it also included several publications which are considered the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are multiple written texts that are largely in dispute. Some people would consider them divinely inspired, some people would consider them like a second tier of scripture, and some people would consider them not divinely inspired but still somewhat relevant and somewhat interesting to read. But more on that later. The New Testament canon largely came together after a result of several different councils and synods. However, throughout the first 300 years of Christian history, there was no set canon. There was no set New Testament for many different reasons. Some people believed that Jesus was going to come back at any given time, so for that reason, they didn't really need to set a canon. Other people simply did not have access to all the books of the New Testament, such as all the epistles. One of the earliest New Testament canons that we have comes from Marcion of Sinope, who published it in the mid-1st century, which contains several gospels. However, it is largely considered to be heretical because he believed in two gods. And after he was excommunicated and he died, there was several movements put forward to establish councils to determine what was biblically canon or not. One of the earliest mentionings of the New Testament in its 27-book form that we have it today comes from 367 AD from Athanasius of Alexandria, and he published a canon in his letter during Easter, which dictated 22 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. However, he did not include the book of Esther in the Old Testament, and he did include the book of Baruch, which is considered apocryphal by many. So that is not considered a true canon. However, it is considered the first time that the New Testament was actually mentioned in its 27-book form. One of the oldest Bibles that we have that depicts the full 27 books of the New Testament is also the Codex Sinaiticus, which is considered to be from the 4th century. And we don't exactly know when it was written. However, what's really interesting about it is that it also contains 2 additional books in the New Testament. So again, whether or not you consider that to be the first Bible to be published is up to you. Now, from what I can tell, the first firm establishment of a Christian canon comes in 382 at the Council of Rome, where the Pope commissions a guy by the name of Jerome to make an official Latin translation of the Bible. Now, previously, there were Latin translations of the Bible, but they were being translated from the Septuagint, which was written in Greek. This time, Jerome was to make a Latin translation of the Bible from the Hebrew Tanakh instead. So he wrote essentially what became known as the Vulgate. And the Vulgate is still used in the Catholic Church today, however, with some mild alterations, and it does include the Apocrypha. Now, an important distinction to make here regarding the first ever Bible being published is that the Eastern Orthodox Church that would later split from the Catholic Church in 1054 would largely translate from the Septuagint, while Protestants and Catholics largely translate from the Tanakh. Now, following the Council of Rome, naturally there were many different disputes over the validity of Scripture as to what translations were the most accurate, what the Scripture actually meant, and what should be included and what should not be included. I don't have the ability to fully explain all of those, but essentially the Council of Rome was validated by the Council of Trent in 1546, and following the Reformation in the 16th century, several different groups of Christians basically formed their own canons respectively. Martin Luther published a German translation of the Bible in 1534, which notably contained a separate section for the Apocrypha, and this largely started a trend among Protestants where they would gradually use less and less of the Apocrypha until about the 1800s, where Bibles were not being published with the Apocrypha hardly at all. In the King James Version, which many evangelical Christians consider to be the only true translation of the Bible, was first published in 1611. So there are a lot of different possible answers to your question, but it really depends on what you believe.